My name is Gavin Evans, and this is my review of Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. And let's just get into my biggest complaint with this movie. Those are not rings. Those are bracelets. Rings go on your fingers. Bracelets go on your arms. Those go on his arms, therefore they are bracelets. This shouldn't be controversial. This movie should have been called Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Bracelets. That would have been a much more accurate title and would have improved this movie substantially. But anyways, while I was watching this movie, I could see a good movie somewhere here. There's enough good story elements present, but unfortunately this movie does nothing with them, and it's yet another complete disaster from the MCU. I absolutely hated this movie. The bright spot of it is Tony Zhang. He does the best job he could have done with the material given to him. There's only so much that man can do when he's given such terrible material, but I do think that he did a good job with that material, and he is easily the best part of this movie. The main character, played by Simu Liao, sorry if I mispronounced his name, which I almost definitely did, I found him to be a very dull protagonist. He doesn't add any life or personality into this movie. He does a fine enough job at what the movie requires him to do. He doesn't bring this movie down, but he definitely doesn't elevate it. And Awkwafina is, well, Awkwafina in this movie. Exactly what you'd expect from her. There's a few moments where she adds some nice personality into the movie, but those moments are too few and far between that it doesn't really impact my overall thought. It's pretty weird though, because the movie sets up those two characters as best friends. That they've been best friends for such a long time and they do everything together. And then they go on this quest together, and despite sharing a lot of screen time together, they don't really have a lot to do with each other. I can only think of one scene where they actually have a sit down and talk. So considering that their friendship was set up as like one of the big parts of each character, and the fact that that element wasn't carried throughout the entire movie, I just found it to be a very odd choice, and an odd choice that did not work for me. I also found this movie to be a complete mess. The flashbacks in this movie were just used in such a sloppy manner. Like, flashbacks can be used in a brilliant way that recontextualizes everything that you've seen up until that point, like in Last of Us Part 2. But here, they just bring the movie to a complete halt. It completely slows everything down, and they just don't feel like a natural progression of what we're seeing. It just feels like, oh, stop, flashback, stop, flashback. It just felt like a cheap exposition device. And speaking of exposition, this movie is filled with it. Like, the writing in this movie is so blatant and in your face. They tell you everything that you need to know. The first rule that everyone knows is show, don't tell. And this movie just tells you everything. There are so many moments where people are just telling the audience and the characters so much information at once. And that's just not interesting. Have a way that communicates it to us on a visual level. That's the point of movies. And I just thought that entire element was completely sloppy, and pacing and structurally, this movie just felt like a complete mess. I also found the soundtrack in this movie to be really bad. For some reason, they decided to go with rap, which just didn't fit the tone of this movie whatsoever. And it's really only present in the first act. So it feels like they're establishing a tone that includes rap, but then it just completely disappears for the rest of the movie. It's just a really poorly done element. And the score by Joel P. West was so incredibly underwhelming. There are so many moments that are trying to build themselves up to be these moments of just awe and wonder. Like, look at what you're seeing. Look at what the characters are experiencing. And you just feel none of it. And I do think lots of that isn't due to the poor directing and the underwhelming score. Score should lift the movie up. When it's a moment that could have emotional impact, the score gives it extra emotional impact. And this movie just underwhelms time and time again. And lots of the emotional moments just lack any emotional impact. And I think lots of that is also due to the lack of build-up. When this movie's plot begins, and the plot of this movie is ridiculously stupid, but when it begins, there's no build-up. It just happens. And that's what happens in this movie time and time again. Things just happen. This happens, and that happens, and this happens. There's no build-up. There's characters that get introduced with no build-up. There's villains that get introduced with no build-up. It just feels very poorly written, like nothing was established, and that is like one of the most important things. In order to have a payoff, you have to have a build-up. And the only element in this movie that has any sort of build-up is the family dynamic. And just the direction they ended up taking that, which I'll get to in a bit, just didn't work for me at all. Everything else in this movie lacked any sort of build-up. And what's this movie even about? Like, yes, I know what the plot of this movie is about, but what's it about? Like, what are the bigger ideas they're trying to get across? Like, what is this movie trying to say? What is the movie doing with its characters? Because at the end of it, it just feels so irrelevant. You watch Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, and you feel that all the characters have changed by the end of that story. It feels relevant. It feels important to every character impacted. But by the end of this movie, it just felt like nothing. Like, the main character has no real inner conflict. The family stuff just doesn't hit on that level, and there's no bigger ideas or themes that it's trying to explore that really pushes a character forward in an interesting way. You watch a movie like Kung Fu Panda, and not only does he have to be Tai Lung, but he has to become the dragon warrior internally forced. And that's such a great, well done element of that movie. And you just get none of that here. Also, I found this movie to be incredibly ugly. I just found it to be very dark. Lots of times, I couldn't even tell what was happening. It was just a very dark, visually ugly movie to look at. And the CGI was pretty bad. Like, you know how everyone loved Black Panther in its first 2 acts, and then everyone complains about the last act of Black Panther and the mess that it is? It's like Kevin Feige looked at those criticisms and was just like, yeah guys, let's just do the last act of Black Panther again. And that's what it felt like here. Some very questionable decisions made in that last act. In fact, let's get to it. The last act is absolutely atrocious in every single possible way. It is so painfully bad. I just don't know what they were thinking. The villains that show up in the last act just come out of nowhere. I don't feel like they were established at all. And just everything going on, it just felt made up on the spot. It's just a complete mess. And the thing that baffles me the most is that they build up this fight between father and son the entire movie. And when we get that on full display here, the movie just eventually throws it away and just decides to go for the big CGI finale. Like, there's definitely a father-son fight there, but by the end of the movie, the big final fight is something else entirely. And why would you go in that direction? If it was just the father and the son fighting, just in an open field, for goodness sakes, I would have been much more satisfied with that. But instead, they had to go too big, and it just bit off way more than it could chew. And in fact, it completely ruined not just the last act, but everything that came before it. Because the one element of this movie that I was constantly intrigued to see where it would go was the family element. And just to see the lack of payoff was just a baffling, awful choice. Okay, just a few more notes. The villain's sidekicks were completely forgettable. I don't even know if they said their names. Yes, you saw it in the trailer. Abomination shows up for a few seconds, and yes, he shows up for a few seconds. That is all. And even the only moment that you see with him that's not in the trailer is just a terrible, awful moment that whatever. The humor is predictable. Whenever someone was about to make a joke, I could say the joke in my head before they made it, and sure enough, they made it. The humor in the MCU is just so cringy and predictable at this point. I'm sick and tired of it. There are a couple good jokes made by a character who I won't say who it is, who does show up, and he just is kind of there to be the comedic relief, even though the movie is filled with comedic relief characters, but whatever. But the character could have not been in the movie at all, and I would have been perfectly okay with that. Like, why did this movie need comedy? Like, why does this movie have to have so many jokes? Like, can't they just have a serious movie for once? Just for once. And also, the ending and the post-credit scenes are completely cringe, and there's a character that completely breaks continuity with the rest of the universe. I'll just say that. Anyways, I absolutely hated this movie. I thought it was a complete mess in every single possible way. Nothing was established or built up to. The one good element eventually gets thrown away for a messy CGI failed finale, which just was mind-numbingly awful. Like, I wanted the last act to end as soon as it began. I thought the writing was really bad. I thought the performances were all really flat. The characters weren't interesting. Oh, and I totally forgot to mention the action. The action's pretty decent in moments. There was one or two really good fight scenes. But even though the choreography is really impressive, and it is really impressive, the cinematography and the editing were just really bad in those moments. They kind of took away from the choreography. Like, just way too many cuts that it really dampened those moments. But Yeah. Anyways, I didn't like this movie. I'm gonna go ahead and give Shang-Chi and the Legend of the 10 Bracelets a 3 out of 10. Okay, did you see it? Let me know what you thought about it in the comments down below. Make sure you like, make sure you comment, make sure you subscribe. Stay tuned for some more videos soon, and Gavin out.